Okay, so the first lesson we're doing in this unit, the unit's on ratios, proportions, proportional thinking. We're starting with talking about ratios, rates, and unit rates. So we have a couple of definitions we need first. First is the definition of a ratio, which is just when you compare two numbers by division. Okay, and there are a couple ways that you can write ratios. One of them is to use the word two. You write 2 to 5. You're comparing 2 and 5. That's a ratio. Another way is to write it with a colon. You still read it as 2 to 5. It's just a different way of writing it. But the most common way we're going to write it is as a fraction. And when you're doing it as a fraction, first number goes on top, second one on bottom. And the reason it's the most common is notice it says we're comparing by division. And the line in a fraction means to divide. And so 2 to 5 is how we would read it. Those are the three ways to write a ratio. We're going to mainly use the fraction. All right, a rate. A rate is a ratio. It's made up of numbers with different units. So you actually see examples of rates all the time. Um, when you're driving down the road, signs, miles per hour. That's a rate. You're comparing miles and hours. Those are two different units. Whenever you go to buy things, like if you're buying gasoline, that is priced as a dollar amount per gallon. So you're comparing money and gallons. So that's a rate. If you go to a store, you're buying fruit or meat, things like that. You buy it at a price per pound. So you're comparing money in pounds. All of those things are rates because they have different units that you're comparing. It's still a ratio, but they have different units, so it's a rate. A unit rate is a rate where the denominator is 1. So actually all those examples I gave you, price per gallon, price per pound, miles per hour, when you see that word per, hear that word per, that means for one of them. And so when you have miles per hour, that's a unit rate. It's the number of miles you can drive in 1 hour. If you're buying gas and it's a dollar amount per gallon, 3.65 per gallon, that means it costs $3.65 for 1 gallon. So your denominator is 1. So those are all unit rates. All right, so let's look at some examples of how we do these, what we do with these. Okay, the first one, real simple, just a ratio, the ratio of girls to boys in a class. Now this is just a ratio, not a rate, because we're talking about people. Girls and boys are both people, so it's still a ratio. The units are the same. Let's say there were 6 girls in the class and 11 boys in the class. Okay, then the ratio would be 6 to 11. Or you could write it 6 colon 11, or we could write it 6 over 11. The important thing is when you're doing these, you make sure you have your units in the right order. So the girls, they wanted first, so that number has to come first. The boys, they wanted second, that number has to come second. Okay, so just be careful with both ratios and rates that you're putting your units in the right spot. Okay, now here's an example of a rate. We have 5 rows of seats for 20 people. Okay, so if we wanted to know the rows per people, then that would be 5 over 20. If we wanted the people per rows, then it would be 20 over 5. Okay, so again, pay attention, make sure you put them in the correct order. You'll usually are going to see when we're talking about a rate, they include the units so that you know which one should go on top, which one should go on bottom. Okay, here's another example of that. You drive 300 miles in 5 hours, make it a unit rate in miles per hour. Okay, this is my key right here. They want me to do this in miles per hour. So that means I have to, when I set this up, put miles over hours. Okay, well now that's easy. I can look up here. I went 300 miles, so that's goes with my miles, in 5 hours. So that goes with my hours. There's my rate. Now they did want me to make this a unit rate. So the definition of a unit rate was a rate where the denominator is 1. So I'd have to ask now, well, how do I get to have a denominator of 1? Well, it's actually the easy thing to do is just divide by whatever this denominator is. If I do 5 divided by 5, that's 1. But when I have a fraction, if I do something to the bottom, I also have to do it on top. So I divide by 5 on bottom, I divide by 5 on top. 300 divided by 5 is 60. So as a unit rate, if I can drive 300 miles in 5 hours, that's the equivalent of driving 60 miles in 1 hour. And this would be my unit rate because it has a 1 on bottom. We could also write it as 60 miles per hour. Remember I said, you see that per, that means for 1. So that means you do 60 miles for 1 hour. Now, this one down here, I actually want to do this 2 different ways. 2 things I want to show you here. Joe can skate around the ice rink 5 times in 3.5 minutes. So what is that rate in seconds per lap, and what is that rate in minutes per lap? I'm actually going to start with the minutes per lap first. So again, pay attention to the units. Which one's going where? It's minutes per lap. So I'm put my time up top. That was 3.5 minutes, and it was 5 laps. Now I have my rate, but I want it per lap. I want a unit rate. So just like we did up here, I'm going to divide by what's on bottom. So divide by 5, divide by 5. That will give me my 1 lap on bottom, and then I can figure out how many minutes that is. Well, this one looks a little bit different than up here because I'm dividing, but I have a fraction. It's 3.5 divided by 5. So how do you do that? Well, if you remember dividing fractions, first thing I have to do is make this improper. That would be 7 over 2. I have to make 5 into a fraction. That's 5 over 1. Then when I divide, I flip the second fraction over, and I multiply. So when I do that, 7 times 1 is 7. 2 times 5 is 10. So it would be 7/10. So that comes out to be 7/10, and that's my answer. It takes 7/10 of a minute to go 1 lap. Now, that's great. We can do this. People aren't, we're not used to seeing a fraction and dividing. It's good to practice that and remember. But this doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We don't know how long 7/10 of a minute is exactly. And that's why where we can change this to seconds per lap. And this is another thing you have to be careful with rates. You always want to make sure your units are in the right spot. So if I want seconds per lap, seconds would go on top, laps on bottom, and still 5 laps. But sometimes when you're doing rates, you have to change. You might have to change both units, might have to change just one. They might give you a time, miles and hours, and they might want the rate to be feet per second or feet per minute or something like that. And so you would actually have to change both units. So how do I do that? I have 3.5 minutes. How do I make that into seconds? Well, I know that 1 minute is 60 seconds. So that means 3 minutes, if I multiply by 3, would be 180 seconds. I know half a minute would have to be 30 seconds. So 3.5, if I add those together, would be 210 seconds. So there would be my rate, 210 seconds per 5 laps. If I want to make that into a unit rate, just like I have been doing, I divide by what's on bottom. So divide by 5. So I'll get my 1 lap on bottom, so now I have a unit rate. And 5 goes into 210 42 times. So it'd be 42 seconds per lap, or 7/10 of a minute per lap. So the big things to remember about your rates, make sure you get the units in the right spot. Make sure you have the correct units. You may have to change them like I did on this one. And to make a rate to a unit rate, you just divide by what's on bottom. And that's it.